operational reach and endurance in a globally distributed anti-access area denial environment. We think that that sets the record for the longest panel title in the history of any hot topic that we have hosted here. The panel moderator for this panel is Lieutenant General Bob Dale, United States Army retired, who's the President, Supreme Group LLC. Joining him as the panel chair, already introduced by General Perna, is Major General Andre Peggy, the Director for Logistics and Engineering at the United States Central Command. The panel members, Mark Signorelli, we just had a conversation about pronunciation. And so now that if you're on this side of the Atlantic, it's Signorelli. If he's home, it's Signorelli. All right, so, but you can choose your pronunciation today. Mark is the Vice President and General Manager of Combat Vehicles at BAE Systems. Also joining us, Lieutenant General Kathy Gainey, United States Army retired, who is the Senior Vice President for Logistics at Cyprus International. Major General Paul Hurley, Commanding General, 1st Theater Sustainment Command, and Rear Admiral Vincent Griffith, the Director of DLA Logistics Operations at J3 at Defense Logistics Agency. I cannot think of a more well-qualified and diverse panel to address this important topic. And so, Bob, off to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Well, good morning, and we'll follow the same protocols that Mitch Stevenson put in place for his first panel, so we won't really have a whole lot of additional introductions here. I will make one comment. I think that, as General Ham said at the conclusion, that that get the leader development right at the front end, and that will give you the right people and leaders to tackle big issues like this. And this is a very, very important issue. It's got a long title, but very, very key to getting sure that our United States Army can be sustained at operational distances as we begin to think bigger and bigger about employing this great Army of ours. The panel chair, it's a great honor to be with Andre Peggy. I first came in contact with Andre Peggy when I was looking at a Sterling O officer record brief at a command board many years ago. And in our subsequent dealings with each other and a couple of issues we've worked, it's great to be with you and serve with you and have you as the chair today. So without further ado, we'll have opening comments and opening remarks by each of the members, and we'll start with General Peggy. Andre?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, sir, for helping mentor again, as you've done through the years, as we put this panel together today. Sir, General Ham and General Perna, sir, thank you both for this gracious invitation. It's a great, wonderful opportunity to participate in today's panel, and especially with such a distinguished group of panel members that we have represented on the dais, as well as the number of significant mentors that we have in the room. So it's just a great opportunity. What I'll try to do is be brief, and if you can bring up my first slide, please. And I'll make my comments in the context of the CENTCOM AOR, if that's okay. I think if my peers, other COCOM 4s would be here, I think their comments would be very similar. Next chart. And if we look in the upper left-hand quadrant here, and you heard my good friend Darrell Williams talk about the doctrine and the great work that he's doing with leader development at TRADOC. I think TRADOC got it right when he talked about the characteristics of distributed operations in the future. When they talk about joint expeditionary operations, that's exactly what we do. Almost every operation is a joint or multinational operation. If you go to Al-Assad now, you see the Marine brigade there, and you have an Army element, you have an Army platoon of Gray Eagles fully nested with the Marines. Visited them a month ago with Mr. Estevez and Admiral Brown and a couple others, and the Marine brigade commander said the only thing that he needs really is a Army supply company to do the logistics. Well, you got what you got. But that's the operation that we currently operate in. Multinational coalition, that's what we do, advise and assist. I think Paul may talk, and if he doesn't talk about, ask him about FML, and then stand back and he'll talk about FML limitations and restrictions and the challenges that's providing us as a sustainment and logistics community. But that's the operation and that's the environment that we currently operate in, and definitely in austere locations. The locations, the FOBs that we currently operate in Iraq today are not the FOBs that you recall, the old Al-Assad, the old Taji, the BDSC, they are austere and limited in capability. And more importantly, with the FML restrictions, they are limited primarily to the operators. Although they're performing sustainment missions by and large, Paul Hurley will tell you that he probably only has a very small percentage and not the number of sustainers forward to execute those tasks. So how do we get at that? Contracting is another opportunity of how we execute some of those tasks. When we look at operations, we have to be agile and responsive. That's always been our requirement, and that continues to be a requirement today. But we do that by executing missions with our national partners. I was telling General Dale that I've learned so much in this job. I knew a bit about logistics, but I didn't understand how important and significant that relationship is with our national partners. You can talk about Transcom and DLA, but we could not get to the fight and sustain the fight without those national partners, and they are extremely important to everything that we do. We must globally manage, have visibility and globally manage commodities, munitions. I could talk ad nauseum about munitions, but we're short. Our financial system, how Congress mandates our budget, we don't have the munitions sufficient to execute the fight, and we're challenged to get them to the local place that we need to. Prepositioned stocks continue to be important, but these stocks now are not only used for us, but they're used for our coalition partners as well. They're being consumed, and we as an Army are challenged to a degree to replenish those stocks because there are competing priorities. CENTCOM is not the only game in town. I'm sure Dwayne Gamble's going to talk to you about what the great and wonderful things and requirements that he has in UCOM, and those are significant requirements. Same thing in PACOM. So we compete with those same requirements. And what I was really surprised was that we did not have, we've been in this current AOR since at least Desert Storm, significantly since Desert Storm, and we did not have ground locks throughout the GCC countries. Amazing how important that is. And if we're going to be able to have a distribution network that works, we have to have redundant distribution networks. And that's, I think, that gives us the capability and mitigates the risk that we have with our distribution networks. Next chart, please. If you ask me what some of our biggest challenges are with distribution, it's access, basing, and overflight. I'm sure that's not new. Those of you that operate in the theater, that's always been our challenge, but it has not changed over the years, although we continue to operate there consistently and continually. Some of the initiatives, and one of the things that we're most proud of, I just talked about, we did not have a ground lock. We've started what we call the TAN. And I think, Paul, I don't know, he'll take credit, I'll take credit, we'll both take credit together for coining that new acronym, the Trans-Arabian Network. But we have a ground lock now, and our countries in the GCC really don't get along well together. But they're now we've agreed to move ground convoys from Aqaba in Jordan to Saudi Arabia to Kuwait to Bahrain to Qatar to UAE. First time we've ever had that happen. So if we are not able to fly overflight, or if we are not able to use our sea routes, maritime routes, we can still use ground locks. So a tremendous capability. And then go to my last slide, please, quickly. And customs continues to be a challenge. We're trying to support Iraq. They'll have a political request into our senior leaders, and we will immediately fly those items into Kuwait, and then they won't let us cross the Cape crossing from the ground lock. They won't allow us to fly it in unless we have submitted a custom request 10 days in advance, and then they're constantly complaining that we can't get them what we asked for, and the president said that we were going to give it to them. But they fight us every step of the way. That's not new, continues to be challenging. So again, another one of our challenges with distribution and really gives us the example of why we need redundant distribution networks. And I'll pause there and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much, General. General Gainey. Kathy, why don't you take it next?
It's interesting to see. Thank you for teaching me again. There we are. It's interesting to see the same sort of topics that I wanted to talk about that General Begay addressed, because I think, we've all lived the challenges of getting from A to B and then sustaining ourselves. So from when I talk, I'm talking about from my knowledge from my joint staff, J4 time, and the time at Transcom. So, I've got a couple of key steps that I always think about that, address how I think are the steps that you have to take. And the first one is to look at the possible places that you might need to go. And you have to do that in concert with the COCOM that you're going to, and looking at what is their concept of operation, how do they envision making this happen, what are the key nodes that they want to use in the way of airports, seaports, and then how are they looking to see how they're going to move it forward, because you may have to make a jump forward if all of a sudden one of those nodes is blocked. Andre talked about the need for redundancy, and that is so important. So again, looking at what are the other options on the routes, where else can you go to make that same effect? Because again, we saw the issues of the Northern Distribution Network when that got blocked and how we had to create, of course, an alternative to that. The next is the protection of those critical assets, both physically and cyber. Whether it's a node you're trying to protect or an IT system, you have to prioritize and look at who is helping protect that and what actions do you need to take to protect that. Next is looking at the military and commercial assets that are available. We know that we do not have enough of our military assets to do the mission. So you have to look at both what you have organically in the U.S. with commercial and military, but also our partner nations. Where can you work with them for their military assets or commercial contracts that they have, and leveraging acquisition cross-service agreements? Because again, you may not have to bring something if somebody else can provide you that capability, and we have certainly leveraged that in many nations. But if you're not familiar with the acquisition cross-service agreement, that would be a very key step that a military planner would need to take. Again, as he spoke about, General Andre, about the overflight, both for ground and air, where can you transit? And then the last key step is that readiness posture. How well are the forces trained? Because we were trained to go from CONUS or some overseas location into a forward operating base. We have not been training to do that expeditionary. If you're an old dog like me, you remember doing the load plans for your deuce and a halves. You remember actually having to practice that and going to the field and living with whatever was on the back of that truck. If you didn't pack it right, then shame on you. But we practiced that on a regular basis, and then we got evaluated on it, and we didn't allow people to go back to home station when they forgot something for a local training. Again, if we don't have people who know how to move from A to B, that know how to operate in a very lean environment, that don't know how to operate when they lose communications, we are going to be in a hurt. We have to train for that capability for the loss of IT communications, and how are we going to make sure that we can get the information where we need to go. So I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, let's go down to the end of the table, and we'll go to Vince Griffin. First met Vince when he was the N4 Pacific Air Forces for the Navy in the Pacific Theater. Vince?
Hey, sir, thanks a lot. Let's get turned on. Hey, sir, thanks a lot. So I'll start with, you're looking around going, what? There's one uniform that looks different, maybe two, but one for sure. And I guess my only comment is I'm definitely qualified to be here, third time at DLA. But what really makes me qualified is, one, I've been trained and mentored by Lieutenant General Gainey and Lieutenant General Dale, and then course corrected constantly by Major General Pagee and Hurley, so as my battle buddies. So I'm good to go here. So I guess I was tasked with talking a bit about commodity management, and I'll say DLA clearly is a commodity manager. We have 9 supply chains, 23,000 weapon systems that we support, and when I look in the audience, it seems like half the folks here might have worked at DLA at some point or another, so I won't belabor that point. But what I will focus on a bit is the idea of warfighter being first. And that's one that's been part of our, I guess it's part of our culture, strategic PM, but definitely part of our culture. And when I think about that, General Pagee mentioned, hey, CENTCOM, but DLA absolutely works with all the combatant commanders. And so the things that, so when I think about warfighter first, you need to listen to the warfighter and what is he telling you, and that's kind of how you start to manage the right commodities here. And some of the requirements, say for AFRICOM, are different than in EUCOM for the Army. And so that's kind of when I think about that warfighting first, talking to all of our customers and kind of what they need. So although they all operate in different environments, they do have one thing in common, and that's they're very demanding customers. And they really say just, hey, deliver whatever the troops need in the right quantities when the troops need it. That seems to be the standing sort of operational order there, and so it works for us. So how do I kind of stay plugged in? And DLA stays plugged in through senior leader engagement. We have people assigned to different combatant commanders. We have our regional commanders, but just at the very top, General Bush is out, and he has clearly engaged with the services as well as the combatant commanders. So he's visited PACOM, EUCOM, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, and so he's out making sure he touches all those folks. And then I'm out as well as our field commanders are out in the AOR. And I just, General Pagee mentioned that I was in the AOR with him looking at how do we continue to have the right sustainment for these much smaller bases that we have there. And so embedded with him to get that feedback from the ground so then our team of 20-something thousand folks can support warfighters. A couple of things that are different, though, is, we mentioned the time it takes to deliver stuff. Well, now we have a POLAD that we didn't have, say, 7 years ago at DLA, because we need to interface with state departments and others to help move some of these things along and understand kind of where we are. I'll guess one is specifically is fuel in Oman outside the straits there. That's a big deal, and that our POLAD helped us with that. Another big thing we do is we clearly have regional commanders on the ground, and that's to help get in front of the problems and so get feedback from you so we can provide more stuff. I guess the second big piece, though, is industry ties. DLA works hard to gather this information from the warfighter, turn it into a signal to industry. We use forecasting and historical data. And then at some point, I'm going to go to industry and say, hey, I need you to produce stuff, because industry produces 99% of what DLA and probably most of our services consumes. It's that partnership that allows that to occur. For us, that occurs with contracting. So now I've got a requirement, I've turned it into a signal, and now we need to contract with industry. And I'll tell you, we have really changed the contracting, as some of us sitting here. $3,000 below buys was the norm, say, 7 years ago, and we're moving away from that. We're not completely away from it, but we're moving away from it. Into some big contracts that deliver speed. And I guess some of our, especially fuel and our, what we call our repair and operations contracts for Class 4, really give us a lot of flexibility. And that flexibility is what's so key. And if I look at just recently in Iraq, when we started this fight with ISIL, we had a JP8 requirement increase 8-fold, and we were able to support that. And so what I'll tell you is you've got to have strong contracts to make that happen. Contingency contracting for the fight of Ebola, we used our working capital fund there to help team with the Army to deliver, to prime that pump and get it going, and just was a better outcome. And then the last thing in contracting is, hey, we're definitely embracing better buying power, and we're looking to do performance-based logistics. So if we're supporting old aircraft and things, so I have to have inventory. We've got about 5 million parts. What I would say is we're working to store the right stuff. I can't store everything because the bill would be too high, but we're absolutely working with the Army and the Army supply plan and then looking at the things that you're storing so we have the right stuff at the right price. Next, I guess I'll think a bit about, long term. How are we going to move from, say, having all this inventory? And I will tell you, I look at long term, look at additive manufacturing. I know it's kind of bizarre now, and everybody thinks it's Star Trek type stuff, but if there's anything there, that is going to give us a lot of capability from keeping things out of transportation and those kind of things. However, for DLA, I do parts, and so for me, it's complicated because I've got to work with their service engineers to get that right anytime we use it. The last thing that I'll talk about there is our effective storage and distribution. Again, I want to move material out to where the customer is if it's required. It's cheaper, you know, when we talk about disaggregated or aggregated, it's cheaper typically when I have it in one big warehouse someplace. However, it's effective when I have it out with you, so I work with you all to tell me where do you want it, and we'll put it there. And then my closing comment, as I go over a minute, I didn't think I would beat Andre, but I did. It's just that I am so proud to be part of this logistics community, and no one does it better than we do, and I couldn't be proud to be part of that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vince. And I'd like to go to Mr. Signorelli, if you will go next, and I'll let the theater commander finish it up and wrap it all together.
Thank you, thank you, General Ham, Lieutenant General Perna, for offering me the opportunity to represent an industry perspective on this topic. I will say I will try to represent some broad themes that you would hear from other industry representatives, although you'll probably hear a lot of BAE Systems examples because those are close to home and easy to reference. In all of these topics, themes are really tied back to a single subject, which is requirements. Requirements drive the entire acquisition, development, and manufacturing process. And I think of a very complex acquisition system, requirements, while they are the genesis and the foundation, are probably the least understood component of that acquisition system. And talking about three different things here. The first is individual platform requirements. There's an old truism, and it is very true. Industry will build you exactly what you tell us to build. The problem is sometimes you don't ask us to build what you want. I think there is a fundamental breakdown in the requirements system and in communications that allow industry to effectively communicate back to the services what the impact of an integrated set of requirements are. General Perna's heard me use this example before, but on the GCV program, now terminated or ended, there were really two requirements that drove that platform from a Bradley-sized platform, about 40 tons, to a 70-ton plus platform. And that was the level of underbelly protection and 11 2015 large male soldiers. Excuse me. Those two requirements grew the size of the vehicle, grew the height of the vehicle, grew the weight of the vehicle to a point where those were the things that eventually brought that program to an end. And we had a very good exchange with the TRADOC and the acquisition team about what requirements were and what the implications were and what might happen. And in fact, on that program, we got two opportunities. But we never were able to really clearly communicate what the integrated set of requirements were until General Dynamics and BAE Systems both built mock-ups, full-scale mock-ups. Everybody walked in and said, "What is that?" And we said, "That's what you asked us to build." So how do we as an industry and services team communicate more clearly and effectively on what requirements really mean in terms of implementation? The second thing is fleet and formation level design and requirements. And I will tell you that is something that's completely missing from the requirements process. We optimize individual platforms. We do not necessarily think very well about what that individual platform does to a formation. By serendipity almost more than anything else, the Armored Brigade Combat Team is approaching a point where there will be a very high level of commonality across that fleet. Bradley, Abrams, and AMPV all using the same running gear, the same engine, the same transmission, many common components. That really wasn't a fleet design requirement. We got there by serendipity more than anything else. Now, So as we move forward and we start to talk about what requirements mean, we need to think about what that means across a formation, an organization, a deployed force, and what can we do up front in specifying requirements that facilitate that. The third thing is long-term investment versus upfront acquisition cost. The budgeting and requirement system and almost every component of the acquisition system focuses on acquisition cost. Every major program I've worked on had life cycle cost requirements, life cycle cost considerations that ultimately were overwhelmed by the realities of the short-term acquisition cost. And I think that really requires, again, the services, OSD, and Congress to sit back and think about how do they want to approach the force design, and will they allow the services to optimize against a longer term or a sustainment set of requirements rather than just acquisition costs. So some thoughts, and I certainly would welcome questions or comments on those topics as we go forward.
Thanks very much. And we'll finish it up here with the theater commander who's wrestling with all these issues today with all this great help he gets from strategic distance, Major General Paul Hurley.
So to put the conversation in context, what I'll do is I'll give a quick overview of the tactical, operational, a little bit of the strategic issues in CENTCOM AOR. So last time I talked to this group, I mentioned that this was the most complex environment that I'd ever experienced, and really highlighted three things. It's air-centric, FML restricted, and contract enabled. And the combined effects of those three aspects made it wicked complex. But coming back to you about 6 months later, I'll tell you, I'm going to add a couple other layers of complexity on top of that. So today, our environment cuts across multiple COCOM boundaries. We coordinate a lot with EUCOM and AFRICOM on issues related to Israel and Turkey and Libya and Egypt. We're working with uncooperative sovereign states that quite frankly may not even have their own best interest in mind as we're trying to work with them. And we're supporting multiple coalitions, both Arab and mixed Arab Western coalitions that may or may not work well together, mostly on the may not work well together. But we have had some successes. So we've, Andre talked about the Trans-Arabian Network. The SCDC guys would come back to me and go, do you realize if we push this cargo over the GLOC, we're gonna have it, gummed up in customs, and I'm creating little train wrecks across the theater because we'll never know what those requirements are until you actually cross a boundary. So by doing that, creating those little train wrecks across the theater, we're actually discovering what the customs requirements are, and our Trans-Arabian Network, which is the Arabian version of the NDN, has dramatically improved over the past 6 months. We're supporting the growing volume and velocity of operations in both OFS and OIR. And as Lieutenant General Perna can testify, we are consuming at unprecedented rates. And keeping this unclassified, it was mentioned to me that we're consuming material in greater volume than was anticipated for 2 simultaneous MRCs. And that's just what we're doing right now. So let there be no doubt, it may not be a decisive action maneuver war for U.S. forces, but it is maneuver warfare for the Iraqi forces, and we are supporting that as well. We're supporting the combat operations using an innovative mixture of military assets, large-scale commercial contracts like DLA provides, and local small-scale service contracts. And in order to do all that, I really had to go to school on how the SOF community does distributed virtual mission command. So I visited a number of SOF headquarters across CONUS, and we have now mastered the art of virtual distributed single sustainment mission command, and that requires a lot of things. So high-tech communications architecture, refined battle rhythm to make sure that in the sweet spot that pulls in those elements from around the world, you can get all those players into the right forms. And we synchronize the main command post at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the operational command post in Kuwait, our sustainment brigades in Iraq and Afghanistan, and elements in countries around the region providing direct support to OIR. And really, it's all about integrating joint, combined, and contracted enablers at the speed of war. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so I'll quickly run through this. FML is a new operational reality, and it's really highlighted some doctrinal gaps that we've got, and it's really forced us to figure out how to provide better logistic support without the force structure that we've been used to. So the picture on the left is doctrine, what we're supposed to have on the battlefield from a sustainment perspective to do what we're doing. The picture on the right is what we've got by FML. And what that does is it forces us to be very, very innovative about how we go ahead and do things. So the first point I'll make is the TSC had to have the wherewithal and the capability to think across current operations, and future plans and beyond. Because if you're talking about contracting, it goes way beyond the future plans planning horizon. And we needed to have the capability, because we don't have the force structure because of FML, to operate at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels simultaneously. The way we've done that is we've created a hybrid ESC-TSC command, and because the ESC is very, very deep in the CUOPS and FUOPS in G3 areas by force structure, and the TSC is deeper in the G5 plans arena that's lets you get after the strategic stuff. So by reconfiguring a hybrid headquarters, it allows us to think across all planning horizons on all levels of war simultaneously. And with that, I'll kick it back over to you, sir.
I'm glad you finished it up with Mission Command, this distributed and virtual Mission Command that can operate on exterior lines around the globe. And I think it's a comment I've talked to Gus about it, I've talked to Andre about it, and I think it's something we have to continue to develop and get good at and train at. All right, we'll open it up for questions now, and we've had some great questions come in from the audience, and we've kind of divided them up, and I'll let General Pagee take the first shot at it. So, General Pagee.
Oh, thank you, sir. How can the Army shift toward an expeditionary mindset and improve its ability to rapidly transition into operations and reduce requirements for RSOI? I think there's a number of things that we can do. As I looked at this question, first thing came to mind is continue pre-positioned equipment as well as critical munitions. And I think what we got to get out of the mindset of COCOM-owned equipment. We got to share munitions. As we are short equipment and munitions, we have a set of equipment. We have APS-3, for instance, which is a swing stock. I think all of our stocks, all of our APS fleets will have to be shared as we continue operations in the future. And to continue to improve logistics interoperability with our partner nations. We have several weapons systems that about 2 years ago, working with John Williams, who then was a TSC commander, we determined that we had an operational readiness issue with one of our major weapon systems, but we found that we had that system owned by several of our partner nations, and we had capability forward that we're not taking advantage of. So we must continue to improve and look for opportunities where we can improve interoperability with our partners, train with our partner nations, exercises with our partner nations, and we continue to do that within the CENTCOM AOR, and I think that continues to pay us dividends as we continue to try to rapidly execute operations. Continued the integration of our national partners. You've heard Vince talk about the tremendous asset that DLA is to our warfight, and we could not be successful without DLA, without TRANSCOM, without Army Materiel Command, and our commercial partners. I mean, it's really a fight with all of us to get at the right place at the right time with the right equipment and be able to sustain the contingency operations that we continue to execute throughout the CENTCOM AOR. And the last item I talk about is operational contract support. And Darrell kind of talked about it, and I think he's leading this effort for the Army. But I think contract will continue to be absolutely critical for success as we operate in contingency and expeditionary environments. What we found in Jordan, for an example, is we have 4 components operating in Jordan. Marines, Navy, Air Force, and the Army, of course. and we were all contracting for NTVs. We were all contracting for cell phones. We were all contracting for water. And what were we doing? We were jacking up the price, and we were competing against ourselves. We competed against ourselves, and we competing against our coalition partners. So we really got to get our arms around in how we manage operational contract support. I know Darrell is leading that for the team. I think Admiral Brown would talk about that from a joint perspective later this afternoon. And you heard Vince talk about the importance of contracting, that he does that from a national partner perspective. Continue to be extremely important, and that's something that we got to continue to get our arms around and work together as a team and not compete against each other.
Thanks a lot. Let's go to Admiral Griffin.
All right, my question was, it was asset positioning. It says, in light of anticipated anti-access area denial challenges, what has DLA done or is prepared to do to meet critical mission requirements forward in a timely manner? So I'll start with one, just pre-positioning of material. We've got a number of depots out there now. We heard about the TAN. Just in that area, you know, Bahrain had typically been thought of as the Navy's depot. Well, it isn't. It's DLA depot that can house anything. And when challenged by Major General Pagee and Hurley to, hey, let's put some other stuff in there, we're doing that. And so we're moving big things over, and then the whole TAN that we talked about, that'll enable that to move that stuff around at a cheaper price. So that's one thing we're doing to get ahead of that. Next is deployable depots. And what we found is when we had the Ebola exercise, we were trying to get out, Transcom was trying to get out, and they weren't linked. Today, General Bush has now worked with Transcom, and so our deployable depot is linked with his joint port opening and airfield opening, so we go out together, make assessments. Stuff comes off of an airplane, off of a ship, then they figure that out, then we move it to a warehouse and get it to the right place. So that, to me, is something that just in the last 2 years we've done to really kind of get ahead of this problem of getting out there with a combatant commander. He has a requirement to move stuff someplace, airfield or a port. We move it there for him with Transcom, and then now enable those folks to start doing their job. Last thing, again, is we have people forward. We have regional commanders, and if you don't have a regional commander, we've probably got an LNO or someone there to gather that information of how quickly you're changing in your battle space, get that back to DLA so we can try to turn that into a different outcome for you. And then just, again, that strong partnership where I do have regional commanders with Andre and Pacific. The DLA person is probably right down the hall from them. And so they're in there trying to, I hope, and I've heard the feedback, it's like they're part of their team. They're executing as part of their team to get those requirements back to us. So, and then the last thing is we're really working with Transcom and others with these COOP exercises. If something does go wrong with the, and we're hacked, how do you operate in an environment where you with denied services? And so we're doing some work there with Transcom. I can tell you, if I only needed to move 4 requisitions a day, I'd be in great shape. That's what our COOP proved, that we could really knock that out. But when it's thousands, we're challenged. So we've still got some work to do. So.
Yeah. Thanks a lot,
So I'll
Vince.
just stop there.
We'll know what you're doing for the next several months. General Gainey.
I'll take this question about how can the Army improve on its ability to project the force into an operational area and sustain it in the face of anti-access and area denial challenges. So I think we need to look at first the deployment infrastructure. I know that Army G4 is working hard to go back and look at, you know, our facilities that we're expecting to deploy from. But not only that, we need to take the next step and look at the facilities we think we're going to go to in concert with the COCOMs to look at what infrastructure is there, what is the capability, what is the throughput, and where should we perhaps prioritize investment. I think, you know, Pacific Pathways has some really great lessons that we can learn from that about how the people who are actually going through those exercises have now developed and gone back and changed their TTPs and their SOPs because of what they learned. I was able to sit in on a lessons learned where 2nd Brigade was back briefing some of the Army staff on their lessons after their recent redeployment. And they said, The CTC, now in retrospect, seems like a dream. When they actually had to exercise it and do the Pacific Pathways, they said, oh my gosh, that was the PhD. And so many things I didn't think about came up and I had to adapt to that. But again, you know, one of the things I pointed out to them is they need to go back and share that not only with their team and peers, but they need to share it back with the schoolhouses so that CASCOM can be going back and looking at, okay, how do we educate people on this new methodology so that we have a more expeditionary mindset? And you've got to exercise it. You've got to continue to do the EDREs, but you can do a lot at the local level of, again, forcing that ability and discipline to do the tasks that we all know are the basic building blocks at that young soldier and NCO level that are going to allow them to be able to execute mission-type orders.
Mr. Signorelli.
So this is one that I get asked in a lot of places. I'm sorry. There we go. This one I get asked more frequently than I would expect. But what are the trades the Army has to make to get lighter, potentially smaller vehicles that are more readily deployable? What emerging new technologies will help with those trades? I think the first thing, but even before you do the trades, is clarity of requirements. You know, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And in parallel with that is don't overspecify. Very often there are things that we can do that may not be essential, but when they get written into a specification, I have to deliver that capability. Along with that, very frequently we chase the last 5 to 10% of performance in the corners of the envelopes, and in order to do that, I mean, we are adding excess capability that for 95% of the vehicle's life never gets used. And so I think those are even prior to the trades. When you get into trades, then I think you've really got to figure out where does deployability and sustainability stack up in the priority of trades. If you look at the tiering of requirements for major acquisitions that come out, you will, I'll say never, and I'll be precisely wrong, but you won't see sustainment or supportability requirements in the tier one of those requirements set. There may be one or two that are tier 2, but beyond that, they are usually tier 4, tier 5 requirements. And until those get raised up and they become design drivers, they're going to get traded off. And so I think there's some focus there. Second piece in terms of new technologies, the one I think there's a lot of hope for, and unfortunately I'm not necessarily as hopeful as many, is active protection. You know, can we use active protection to trade off armor and weight of vehicles? And I will tell you, I will unequivocally say in the remainder of whatever my career length is, that won't ever happen while I'm doing things. Not because I wouldn't like to see it happen, but as threats evolve and as active protection systems are not 100% reliable, I don't see a situation where we would make a design trade to take armor or protection off of a vehicle. Active protection is really an enhanced level of survivability. It really isn't a replacement for what I'll call passive survivability. And I think when we do that, we can then start to optimize vehicles around how much armor, what threats can we handle with what survivability techniques. But it's not a panacea, and it's going to be a very long time, I think, before we ever design a vehicle around active protection as being the primary survivability. The last thing I'll talk about a little bit is